right, I will go ahead and call this meeting to order. The purpose of this meeting is for the St. Louis County Council to meet the new police chief, Mary Barton, and to hear about her vision and plans for the department, especially around the issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion and reform, and to hear remarks from Police Commission Chairman Ray Price. The committee takes official notice of and admits into evidence all St. Louis County ordinances and resolutions. We will go ahead and get started. Do you need to call the roll, Diane?
Yes, ma'am.
Please go ahead.
Councilmember Clancy.
Here.
Councilmember Walton Gray.
Present.
Councilmember Days.
Here.
Councilmember Dunaway.
Present.
Councilmember Fitch.
Here.
Councilmember
Present.
Councilmember Harder.
Present.
Chair, you have a quorum.
Thank you. And I will state this again so that it is officially in the journal. The committee takes official notice of and admits into evidence all St. Louis County ordinances and resolutions. We will begin with a few remarks from myself and from Vice Chairwoman Rochelle Walton Gray. So I wanted to say good afternoon to everybody. Today's hearing comes at the intersection of two significant developments for St. Louis County. First, we have a new police chief, Mary Barton, who is the first woman to hold this post in county history. Second, George Floyd's unnecessary death at the hands of police officers in Minneapolis has triggered renewed demands for racial equity and justice all across this country and here locally, that all of us in county government, across departments and institutions, share a duty and moral responsibility to listen to and consider. Today, we have an important and timely opportunity to hear from Chief Barton. She is joined by the St. Louis County Board of Police Commissioners Chairman, Ray Price, who is also relatively new in this role, along with most of the other 4 commissioners that serve alongside him. This is the first time that each of these individuals have come before the council in these roles, although we have heard from Chairman Price before. I thank each of them for their service. Vice Chairwoman Gray and I have asked Chief Barton to introduce herself to the council, and we've asked both Chief Barton and Chairman Price to share their vision for the St. Louis County Police Department, especially around the topics of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and in response to recent events. As a county official, I frequently hear and have said myself that we know that we're not perfect. What this inherently means is that we recognize that there are things that we can do better. Let's start this conversation today. With a new police chief and a relatively new set of police commissioners, we have a tremendous opportunity ahead of us with fresh vision and leadership to respond to the big question that we all must ask ourselves. What's required of all of us as leaders at this time? And what does this mean we need to do differently? My hope is to work together to answer these questions in order to meet the high expectations and requirements held by the people of St. Louis County, especially during this critical moment. Councilwoman Gray, I believe you have some remarks you wanted to make as well.
I was in the legislature when the unrest in Ferguson started, and I had several meetings with the community, probably weekly or at least weekly. And the community had a lot to say. They were very informative, gave good input, and a lot of those things were addressed in the legislature the following year through legislation for reform. So along the same lines as what Chairwoman Clancy mentioned, I do hope that with this new police commission and new chief, that we can move towards implementing some policies and protocols that can be followed to hopefully help with the climate as it is today. It's been almost 6 years, and I don't think much has changed. I will say again, in 2018, the council signed a resolution. We voted on a resolution to increase training in the areas of racial profiling, de-escalation, sensitivity training, cultural competency, and behavioral health. Um, Money was allocated for that, and I didn't see where too much change was different. Although the funding was provided for the increased training. A lot of people would say, "Well, why is this training necessary?" Um, because you would think that inherently there shouldn't be this issue. If you want to be a police officer, a doctor, a nurse, any of those type of fields, you should already be sensitive and have some type of cultural cultural competency, or should I say some type of leniency towards knowing that there are differences in individuals. However, that is not the case, and it's just the nature of the human, and we want to do more. So I'm not going to keep prolong my statement, but I look forward to working with the chief and the new commission, and hopefully making major strides in this area. So thank you.
Thank you, Vice Chairwoman Gray. With that, I would like to turn it over to Chief Barton. Welcome.
Thank you very much for having us today. I would apologize for us being tardy due to technical problems, so I apologize for that. I don't like to keep people waiting. I really appreciate the opportunity to come before you today and tell you a little bit about myself and my vision for the police department, and include Mr. Price in that discussion. When I was interviewing for the position of chief, I was asked several questions about my vision for the police department, and I spoke about those well in advance of the critical time that the police department, the nation, is going through today. And in those remarks, I talked about my vision for the police department being one of inclusion, as my life here in this department has been mostly on the outside. I spent 42 years in the police department. I worked my way up through the chain, worked my way up through many different levels of supervision, and never really felt like my voice was included. So I talked about how I would like to change that, how I would like to bring everybody to the table and hear their voice and discuss the issues that are important to them. Now, I understand that the ultimate decision is mine because the ultimate responsibility is mine, but I believe in this getting everybody's view and listening to what everybody has to say on the subject really gives you a broader perspective of how to make the best decisions possible for everybody who works here. And that would include, as you know, we started the Diversity and Inclusion Unit. That would include seeking additional training and having a committee where people could bring their concerns to in an advisory capacity. We're really working on reviewing the policies and procedures here to make sure there is inclusion within the policies and that there's no exclusion for any groups within this department. And we've made strides forward in that area. We've been reviewing our policies and procedures. And I think that it's really important for people to understand that no entity, be it a police department, an institution, a hospital, doctor, no one is perfect. And I appreciate your remarks on that. But this police department will look and will review on a continual basis its policies and procedures to ensure procedural justice and inclusion of everybody in as much as it is possible. And it is a high priority for this police department. A couple things that about me is, as I told you, I've been here many, many years. I've seen several changes in the police department, mostly good, but we are in a continual state of change and moving forward. And that's the message I bring here today. We will review, we will analyze, and we will take from what we learn and move forward, and hopefully as a better, stronger, more inclusive and diverse police department.
Thank you, Chief. Chairman Price.
Yes, hopefully you can see why we chose Chief Barton to serve with that particular background. I would like to talk just a little bit about the past week and a half or so. It's almost as if we were watching two different stories. I don't think anyone can have watched the TV coverage of the death of George Floyd or Ahmaud Arbery and not be shocked, especially by those two deaths in such rapid succession. As shocked as we are about that, we also have to be shocked about the unfortunate murder of Captain David Dorn in the city. Violence, whether by police officers or officers, is something we all have to fight and be concerned about. I spoke about two different stories in the past couple of weeks. One of those stories was in the daytime and early evening. Thousands of protesters, responsible, peaceful, making their voices heard in a matter that was extremely important. Protesters to whom the police did not interfere, did not harass, facilitated the voicing of that concern. Then there were the nighttime shootings and lootings, organized, systematic, deadly, launching rocks at police officers out of slingshots, shooting fireworks at police officers, and shooting guns at police officers. The police department, I don't think I could be more proud of the manner in which they conducted themselves. They had planned carefully. They showed restraint almost universally and only responded when it was absolutely necessary for the safety of the people of St. Louis County. As the chief said, we will look at what happened. We will see what we can do to do better. We will learn if we made mistakes. Many of the reasons we performed well was due to the lessons we learned in Ferguson when it was far more difficult, lessons we learned and took at heart. But this will be protocol for us to continue to work on. I think we have all the right policies in place. Much has been said about a new movement. 8 can't wait for policing policies. Those are policies that St. Louis County has adopted since, I believe, 2010, well before this. But the problem is not just having the right policies. It's also making those policies effective 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 52 weeks a year for our 900 to 1,000 officers in everything they do in times of trouble and stress. I think Councilwoman Gray was right when she said the first thing is not to have police officers who are not sensitive to all the people around them. But even sensitive people in times of trouble, distress, emergency, and danger sometimes react incorrectly. And that's why training is so important for us.
Thank you, Chairman. And I would like to remind council members, if you are not speaking, to please put yourself on mute so we can minimize the background feedback noise. At this point, unless there are any further remarks from Chairman Price and Chief Barton, of which I don't think there are at this point, I will open it up to the council members for questions, comments, discussion.
Madam Chair.
Councilwoman Days.
Thank you. And this goes to directly to, I guess, the chief's initial statement. It was a little low at times and kind of hard to hear. But I think that you do have a diversity and inclusion unit within the police department. Is that correct?
Yes, ma'am.
Is it operational at this time?
Yes, it is.
And who is in that department? How many people do you have in that department? Not necessarily who, but how many people do you have in that department?
That is overseen by a captain, and a lieutenant is in charge of the diversity and inclusion unit. And then there's a sergeant who works in that unit and also will fill the role in a risk management facility. Risk management function as well.
So that's a total of 4.
3.
Did I hear that correctly?
3, ma'am.
Oh, 3. Okay, so you have 3 members in that department, and it is my understanding that those 3 people have been reassigned to something else during this particular pandemic. Is that correct?
They were reassigned to different functions within the police department where they were needed. They were, however, not told to not continue their work on diversity and inclusion.
So they will be doing double duty, in other words.
Well, they did, but they're back now in their original assignments.
Okay, so they're back, and so the department is fully functional at this particular point.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, all right. That's the end of my first question, but I do have others, but I'll let my other colleagues have an opportunity. Thank you.
Madam Chair?
Yes, Councilwoman Dunaway.
Thank you. Would you all talk a little bit about some of the reforms that have been put into place since 2014 and kind of the status of where those reforms are, and any accreditations that the department has and how long we've had those?
Well, I'll answer the last part of the question first. We are internationally accredited through CALIA organization. That's an accrediting body that comes into a police department, goes over its policies and procedures, and makes sure they're in compliance with everything, and it gives a certification. I believe we have been CALIA accredited since sometime in the mid-'80s. We just recently went through one last year and received accreditation both across the law enforcement, communications, and academy functions. So we are a tri-accredited agency. The reforms we've put through since 2014, I think the biggest reform is there has been more community engagement. We've developed programs, including the PAL program and certain programs within the community to really start to build bridges within the communities, get involvement from stakeholders within the community, talk about our programs, talk about any of the issues that come up within the individual precinct areas. We've also started, well, as you know, most recently, the diversity and inclusion unit, but we've also developed similar programs within the community, really focusing on the officers interacting with both the younger population within the communities. We've developed cadet programs from citizens 18 years older within the community and law enforcement. We have a law enforcement explorer program, younger age, to get young people interested and accustomed to dealing with law enforcement on a non-interactive basis, meaning it is a non-justice-related basis where they interact on a human level and learn about law enforcement and learn what it's like in the day-to-day operations of the police department and with officers. And we have various programs of that nature, and we also have started more productive programs with area clergy relating to their areas of the county. And we have increased our chaplaincy program within the police department, so our chaplains can become involved in community events as well. Also to use as a sounding board when there are issues or complaints that we regularly reach out to clergy and community members and have regular meetings. And these are the kind of nature of programs we've developed. We listen to the I guess, lessons of Ferguson. And we have become more interactive with the community, more bridging of community. And when there are issues, really sit down and try to talk through the problems using those people and those stakeholders that we've built a relationship with over the years and really maximize that input.
Thank you so much, Chief. I have other questions, but I'm like Councilwoman Days. I want to give everybody else a chance to go first. So I'll hit my next question on the next round.
Chairwoman Clancy, please.
Councilman Harder.
Thank you. Chief, welcome aboard, and we've talked before. I'm curious to find out how many of our officers have completed the CIT course, and is that all the officers or a certain amount when it comes to that specialized training?
Well, to date, sir, 515 of our officers have completed CIT training, which means they're certified CIT officers. All of the recruits in the academy receive blocks of CIT training as well as mental health training. It is specialized training in that there is more hours of training required to become a certified CIT officer. But the main, just a little, I guess, over half of our officers have that CIT increased training, I would say. And that all of them receive basic level of CIT training as they're graduating from the police academy.
Is thing in your vision to make sure that all 900 or 1,000 officers complete that program at some point in time in their career?
We're always looking to increase our training. One of the other things that we do for officers who have not received those additional training is every one of our officers has to go through hours of mental health training, basic mental health training, identifying those people at risk and having in the middle of a mental health episode. So they all receive that training once a year. We do mental health training as well. So would it be my vision that all of them have that 40-hour course? Well, everything's tempered by funds and ability to do it. But yes, I would hope that every officer receives at least a minimum amount of crisis intervention training to make them more understanding and more fluid in their response.
How many officers would you say have been trained in use of force escalation throughout the group of officers that you supervise?
Every officer in this police department has been trained in the use of force continuum, de-escalation, and escalation levels of force on this police department, and is so trained on a yearly basis.
So everyone has that certification and they have to renew it yearly?
I wouldn't call it a certification, but it is training. And we do speak to use of force training every year. We also speak to constitutional law updates and any kind of retraining they need as the law changes on a yearly basis. So yes, that is kept up every year through training.
And finally, do all the officers have the necessary equipment necessary to either escalate or de-escalate those use of force situations?
Every officer in patrol who's on a day-to-day basis who makes contact with the public has the same equipment. They have from numerous items of less than lethal objects all the way up to standardized weapon that all of the officers carry. So yes, all of them are given the tools they need to go from a minimum amount of use of force to deadly force.
Okay, thank you.
Councilman Tracus or Councilman Fitch?
I have questions too.
I'm sorry, Councilwoman Gray, go ahead.
Or should I wait since I made the statement?
No, you can go right ahead.
Okay, that's because I wasn't sure. Several things. You do have an affairs department or area, of course, right? Oh, I don't see chief.
Yes, ma'am. It's the Bureau of Professional Standards.
How many there are now? How does that work? Is it composed of people from St. Louis County Police Department, or is that a
Yes, ma'am.
board, that's a state board?
No, it is composed of officers of the rank of sergeant, lieutenant, and captain currently are assigned to that unit.
And how many people?
6.
How many? 6. And how many of those? How many of the 6 are African American?
3.
Okay. You also mentioned that you've increased the interaction of police officers with the community. And I know you mentioned a couple of things like such as you connected with the clergy, but what, and don't have to name all aspects, but what type of things are they doing to now, just a couple of examples of how police officers are now interacting with the community more than they were before?
Well, I think in the building of the bridges since 2014 in Ferguson, and our officers going out in the community, they're invited to and asked to come to a lot more community events. So they're showing up to actual community events within the precincts and the beats they patrol, and they interact with the people there on a human level, at a picnic, at a neighborhood street party. So they go there and they just interact, talk, let people get to know them. And I think that the basis of any change in how we view others and how others view us is this interaction on a one-to-one level and getting down into a human level with them. As far as the clergy, I have been invited. I have not been able to go because of COVID, but I've been invited to come speak at several events, and I have talked over Zoom meetings. As you know, it's not the most face-to-face way. It's not the most conducive way to talk to people, but we have to make do with what we have. And I think that the basis of all change, whether it be within the communities or anything else, is really a one-on-one relationship. It's getting talking, it's walking in somebody's shoes, it's getting down on the most basic level and really having that hard discussion with people. And that's where a lot of the officers have been spending their time.
So I've heard from several members of the community about what they call neighborhood policing officers, NPOs. One of the things that was discussed several years ago was community-based policing, which I don't really think is similar to NPOs, but it's really not the same. It's not exactly, should I say, the same thing. Have we increased our NPOs and have we done more with community-based policing practices?
Well, the number of NPOs assigned are based on, of course, the precinct that they work in. And we have increased those numbers over the years. And what they have done recently is taken a hard look at how we deploy them within these precincts. Are we getting the best use of these people? Are they really interacting with the community? Because prior to this, a lot of the things they engaged in were what we consider quality of life issues. You know, like people calling about their neighbors' yards or cars parked in the street or things like this. We are taking a look at revamping that program and really getting down into a more grassroots approach to what are the real problems in the community. How can we really help with what's going on in the community? Instead of being the last resort somebody calls when they have property issues with their neighbors or things like that. We want to take more of a look at what can we do to make this neighborhood safer? How can we address the need for more street lights? How can we address the need for crime? So taking a broader approach to what is wrong with those particular neighborhoods and issues really has to be the focus of these NPOs and the neighborhood policing program. So that is coming under review, and I'm hoping that several changes will come out of that review.
Okay, thank you. I'll reserve my questions for later, my other questions.
Councilman Fitch or Councilman Trey, does either of you have any questions for the chief or chairman?
I do.
Go ahead, Councilman Fitch.
Thank you, Chairwoman. Chief, some of the questions I want to ask you about is what we've heard recently in the media from some of the protest groups. What's your thoughts on the comments about defund the police?
I realize that now is a time of great anger and frustration, and sometimes taking an approach that might not be well thought out and maybe ill-advised. What I would tell people who want to defund the police, two things. Number one, you can't just defund the police. You have to have a program or a plan in place of how you're going to train these people and how you're going to accomplish this mission you see that can be better for the community. You can't just throw everything out and start all over again without a plan and without the necessary training and equipment and everything else you need to go along with it. Do I think that defunding the police is a legitimate problem? I think that it is not the solution to the problem. I think the solution to the problem is really sometimes just stop talking, start listening to what people have to say, and really hear them, and hear the frustration, and hear everything that's going on, and come up with mutual solutions to a problem and work together. Defunding the police would have the hardest impact on those areas that need the police the most, and we would increase the victimization of people that are the least able to protect themselves. That's what I would say to the people who want to defund the police.
Okay, and a follow-up to that is, you mentioned training earlier, use of force training, which your officers go through quite a bit of that. One of the things that's going on around the country right now in big police departments in particular is something similar to peer intervention training, where they're teaching the officers to intervene when the officers see a fellow officer doing something that's against the department policy or a violation of the law. Is that something that St. Louis County Police that you're doing now, or is it something you see as a need?
Well, I would tell you that our policies already dictate that officers have to step in when they see violations of the rules and or someone committing a crime. So that has existed in our policies for quite some time. But the policy that you're speaking of, that they call EPIC, which is Ethical Policing is Courageous, and it's a program that I am going to begin research on as part of the information I was going to hand over to the Diversity and Inclusion Unit. And I really think this is a program that has value within this police department because it really talks about all the things that ethical people stand for, doing the right thing when no one's watching, doing the courageous thing. And I really think it has value, and it's a program that I believe I plan to talk over with the board. And I think introduce this training into St. Louis County. I think it holds value, and I think it's an excellent program.
Okay, and my last question is, what do you need from the county council? The only real true involvement the county council has in the police department, because the charter requires the police board to run the police department, is the budget. What do you need from us to make your department be more inclusive and more involved in the community? What do you need from us?
Well, first off, I would say I would love to have your support. And I would ask, and I would invite the members of the council, if you really want to have a true understanding of how this department deals with diversity and inclusion, come to our training, come to the academy, come to our bias-based policing and our racial profiling training. Engage in our virtuous system of how we teach the officers ethical decision-making, critical decision-making, shoot, don't shoot scenarios. Because I think that until you really understand what these officers train and what they do, it's kind of hard to really talk about their diversity and inclusion principles and everything else. You're more than welcome to come to the academy and see our training. I highly recommend it, and I invite all members of the county council to come at any time to review our training, our practices, and I think that you will see we're on very solid ground.
Thank you, Chief.
I certainly have some questions, but I wanted to give everyone else on the council an opportunity to take a first round at questions. Councilman Trey, do you have anything right now?
I'll reserve at this time.
Okay. Chief, I want to pick back up on this conversation about defunding the police. I feel like I'm hearing as I listen to some of the folks that are making this call to action and seeking to understand a little bit more about what they're talking about. What I am understanding, I think might be different than what you're hearing, but I wanted to check that. I think that what I'm hearing is that folks are saying that we need to be investing more in some prevention things related to public health and well-being outside of the police department. And that will probably, unless there are new sources of revenue, require us to take some money for the police department. Is that different from what your understanding of defunding the police is?
I wouldn't say it was different, but I think it goes hand in hand. If you want a police department, and for those people that still want a police department, and you want the most professional, most highly trained, most educated police department that you can get, if you take funding away from that, not only do you decrease the amount of training that you can give them, but you also decrease the quality of the applicants you can attract because you've lowered the salaries there. So it's really a true two-pronged effect. Also, there are several programs within the police department that deal with these mental health aspects that the police department receives specialized training in. And CIT is one of them, but we have a lot of community partnerships with advocacy groups for the mental health issues and domestic violence and a lot of the other, what you would consider non-traditional alliances within the community. So those already exist here. And am I against funding those programs? Absolutely not. I just don't think it should be done at the expense of the police department.
Okay. And I understand a lot of your mechanism for a lot of what you were talking about in terms of addressing folks or engaging with folks in the community who might be under mental distress involves your CIT program. You know, I would offer that one of the things I'm hearing from some people is that sometimes it can be really traumatic for it to be a law enforcement official to be in some of these intervention situations, and that there might be some value in working more closely with folks who are trained with the background of social work instead of first in law enforcement and then with some trainings in crisis intervention. So that might be worth something to explore. There might be some pilot programs and other places to look at. I also, in your opening remarks, you mentioned that you all will be reviewing and analyzing your policies in the police department. Do you have, can you tell us more in depth about what that looks like? What is your plan for that?
Well, our policies are reviewed regularly. And of course, as I said, we just went through a review of all of our policies this past year through CALEA. But we have a Bureau of Research and Analysis that is constantly going out in different areas, different police departments, different areas of the country, looking for best practices, looking to see what other police departments do, looking at the policies of other police departments. We also receive information from the IACP, which is the International Association of Chiefs of Police. We have a local version of that. We go all over looking for best practices and look at our policies, see how they compare, see what's done differently. This unit's sole function is to review those policies, make recommendations to the command staff and executive command staff of this police department and the board of police commissioners to make sure that we are doing the best we possibly can and to look at new ideas from a different perspective. So that is done on a routine basis by a unit whose sole function is the review of our policies.
Got it. I have more questions, but I will pass the baton to another council member if we would like to go for a second round.
I would, Madam Chair.
Councilwoman Days.
Thank you. Thank you. I want to pick up on your community engagement. That was one of the issues that you mentioned. And by the way, I'm hearing that some people are having difficulty in hearing you. I'm not sure if that's the equipment that you're using, but some of you're coming kind of in and out. So I just wanted to make you aware of that. But back to my question regarding the community engagement or some of the reforms that you said you've indicated you put in place. So do you have, it is a specific unit that you have that is dedicated to community engagement? How is that happening? and how are you measuring the effectiveness of your community engagement?
Well, the Bureau I just spoke of Research and Analysis, they do community engagement, a portion of community engagement function in that they do community surveys, they send information out, and they they do this once a year and talk about how our officers are doing in the community. I realize that's only a small part of it. As I have come into the police department, I have looked at all the functions in the department, and I've looked at the organizational chart. And we are in the process of restructuring this police department to put units in the areas that they make sense, that they function out of. And one of the suggestions that I have brought forth and there has been agreement upon is to develop the Bureau of Community Engagement, where we will put things like diversity and inclusion and risk management and community programs will function under that. So that is one of the things moving forward that I plan to do, is I think it makes sense to have a Bureau of Community Engagement when you can include all of these other units within it. Gives you really a good way to assess its effectiveness and to have somebody in charge of it who's held accountable and goes out into the community and deals with these issues as well. And I would say that I really try to encourage the belief that all of the officers who work here are community engagement officers.
So you're going to put together a unit. I just want to make sure I'm hearing you correctly. You're going to be putting together a unit specifically for community engagement.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure. You have inherited a situation with your EEOC complaints. You've had several of those, or this department has had, and it's not just starting with you, it's been previous chiefs as well. And we still have quite a few of those issues out there. And I need to know, what specifically are you going to do to kind of lessen the racial divide that clearly exists with the St. Louis County Police Department, and addressing issues starting from the academy, because that's where people enter into. So starting with that, what are you specifically committed to do to kind of lessen the racial divide that we have here in St. Louis County in terms of the police department?
Well, I think the first thing that you have to do, as you previously mentioned, that training begins the day the recruits walk in the door. We talk about the ethics of the police department. We talk about the policies here. And it begins there. It really does. And it has to be reinforced throughout their entire training here. And we have to be vigilant about observing areas where there are problems. This becomes the responsibility of first-line supervisors. So this requires training for them to be able to observe and report inappropriate behavior. And we have to have a shift in culture here to some degree where we embrace the fact that we will no longer tolerate or no longer put up with inappropriate remarks, inappropriate behavior, things we deem ethical, things we deem insensitive. And it really has to be a culture shift as to everybody, again, with this peer-to-peer intervention, everybody steps up and say, and the onus is on everybody. Hey, that's not all right. Hey, don't do that. Hey, be somebody who speaks up for other people. And until you really move forward in that shift, it really has been the responsibility of the supervisors, captains, the lieutenants on this police department to identify those problems. But I think an early intervention and early warning of how that looks in this police department is absolutely necessary. And I think that as far as you're speaking to the racial divide in this police department, as I've said before, a lot of what goes on is really a failure to understand and a failure to really listen when somebody talks. So I think that the best way to solve that problem, or go a long way to solving that problem, is have regular meetings through diversity and inclusion, through these committee meetings we hold, to listen and really hear what people are saying, whether it's about practices in the police department or issues within the police department, and move from there after we get the information or whatever it is that they want to tell us. But really that talks about sitting down on a one-to-one basis, because that's really the only way you ever solve problems. Get down on the human level, find out what's going on, and then make changes from there. And yes, this department is committed to doing that.
Well, I know that there has been a challenge in terms of consequences. I'm not sure if that the consequences that has been meted out to those who have made those infractions, are necessarily appropriate. But to that end, have you had an opportunity to talk with the ESOP or the NAACP or any organizations like that that are specifically looking at bettering the racial climate within the police department?
Well, during the midst of COVID, as I told you, I reached out to several organizations by phone and spoke to several clergy and several members in those organizations, and have definitely spoken to them about getting moving forward, getting together in person, because I really think those conversations are better in person. I just believe that. And I am in the process of setting up a meeting with the ESOP. I have in person, hopefully now when the building's here open, June 15th, that we can get together, sit down and talk. I really want to hear their concerns. I know this has been an issue that has been prevalent for the last several months, probably last couple of years anyway. And they're wanting to talk about how they view their life here in the police department, and I really do want to hear that.
Okay. Well, and the last question for this go round is, as you're utilizing this diversity and inclusion department, or however we're calling that, it is incumbent in my mind that you reach out to people who do this on a daily basis. I'm sure, and we also have a department within the county that is responsible for diversity, equity, inclusion. Have you reached out to them, or has your diversity and inclusion unit, have they reached out to the county DEI for some assistance or suggestions or anything along those lines?
Yes, ma'am. When this when this diversity and inclusion unit was started, it was agreed that the people that work would receive certification, would receive training in how to build a diversity and inclusion unit that was effective. So they went out to specialized training and received hours of specialized training, and still have more to go to become certified in this area. I know that I just recently received a email from the DEI to reach out and schedule a meeting to talk to them, which I plan to do. Diversity and Inclusion has also held meetings of the committee members of the Diversity and Inclusion Committee, and have gotten some input and ideas about what they'd like to look at moving forward regarding policies and procedures within the police department. So yes, we have reached out to people. We have reached out to other police departments, reached out to business and industry to see what their diversity and inclusion units look like. So this is an ongoing process, and hopefully from all the data and all the information that we gather, we can put together a really fully functional and well-trained diversity and inclusion unit.
I'm hopeful for that as well. Thank you for right now. Thank you.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Madam Chair.
I think, okay, we'll go with, I think I heard Councilwoman Gray first, and then Councilwoman Dunaway, you're after that. Councilwoman Gray.
Yes. Dunaway can go because she was second last time, so I'll just take my order as being third again. That's fine.
That's so fair of you. I really appreciate it, Councilwoman. So, Chief, thanks so much. I want to go back to something that you said a few minutes ago about what we really need is a shift in culture where we no longer tolerate inappropriate behavior, insensitive words. Can we just call that racism? And where do you see systemic racism in the St. Louis County Police Department?
No, I wouldn't call exactly what I was talking about racism. There's all sorts of insensitive comments and inappropriate behavior. It doesn't have anything to do with racism. It's just inappropriate. There's ageism, there's sexism, there's all different kinds of things. And I'm not saying they exist here. And I think to say that there's systemic racism in the police department is overly broad and probably not accurate. I think that to a certain degree, people believe what they believe. And until we sit down and talk about it and can verify or at least ferret out what exactly it is people are talking about, I think to put a label on it is unfair and really short-sighted. And I would say that having been on a lot of these issues with just inappropriate things, people not thinking before they speak, is a far cry from racism.
My next question is, I might circle back to that in a second or maybe on my next round. And I say that because I actually believe we're all racist. I believe we have all been conditioned by society to be afraid of people of color and to see white people as inherently better and more trustworthy. And I think that goes far deeper than, you know, I think it's who wrote our TV shows and the music that we listened to growing up. And it's just these societal influence that impact the way we view others. And I call it racism because that's what my friends of color call it, and I'm listening to them. And I would like to see a bigger conversation about that, but I'll get to my next question first. Do we have any policies that prohibit people in handcuffs from being kicked or kneed or punched or choke held or a chokehold against people in handcuffs?
Our use of force policy, which we put up on our frequently asked questions page on our public website, talks about our use of force policy. We have never authorized the use of a chokehold here for any reason, and people in handcuffs still can resist. So we are taught that we use the least level of intervention and the least level of force to bring the situation under control. But officers have to defend themselves if they're being assaulted, and they can still be assaulted by a prisoner or suspect in handcuffs. But yes, they are taught least level of force necessary to bring the situation under control.
And then what are the consequences for police officers who don't follow that rule?
An internal complaint, if a supervisor has determined that they violated the policy or a citizen files a complaint, a complete investigation is conducted through the Bureau of Professional Standards, and their interviews of witnesses. The suspect is interviewed, the person who's claiming an excessive use of force, the supervisor who initiated the complaint, because most of the complaints received by this department are internal. Our own supervisors report inappropriate behavior of the officers. So there is a full investigation and a recommendation is made as to whether the complaint is sustained or not, and then it moves forward up the chain. And then if any discipline is recommended, then the chief signs off on the amount of recommended discipline. And then the officer is given a copy of the discipline, depending on whatever it is, and it remains, it's considered closed after the discipline is given.
This will be my last question on this round, I promise. If there is some kind of investigation and you determine that a police officer did act inappropriately and suffers some kind of consequences, whether that's punishment or, you know, suspension, financial, whatever, is this public information?
As to what the discipline is, no. But any citizen who files a complaint receives a letter indicating that their complaint was thoroughly investigated and the behavior was either addressed, or the wording depends on what the problem was, of course. But no, the exact discipline the officer receives is not a matter of public record.
Thank you so much.
Madam Chair.
Councilman Harder.
I was supposed to, hello.
I think
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Councilman Harder, I'm going to need to ask you to wait for a minute. I had promised the floor to Councilwoman Gray next.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Councilwoman.
Sure. Going back to diversity and inclusion, When did you implement, or not you, I shouldn't say, when was that implemented?
I'm sorry, when was what implemented, ma'am?
The diversity and inclusion unit or whatever. Is that what it's called? Isn't that a newly formed?
That was implemented under the prior chief, and I believe that was December or January. Just
Okay, and so are you recruiting through that unit? What are you using that unit for? Are you using it to recruit officers? Or is it for it? Okay. No.
We have recruitment officers here out of the Division of Human Resources.
Okay. So I guess I'll back off of that for now. Going back to the Ethical Society of Police, as you know, sometime I think it was last year, the African American police officers, St. Louis County officers, wanted to join ESOP, and they requested an MOU. Where does that stand now? Are they still trying to implement that, or has that just died down?
Well, the last conversation I had by email, was they sent me a request, and attached to this was an MOU, and they said they wish to discuss it at a meeting, and we have not yet set up that meeting date, but I'm sure that when they come in, they will bring that request again for review of that MOU. I fully expect that.
Okay, so the African American officers would like to still pursue that. Also, you mentioned the academy. How many African Americans are currently going through the academy?
You mean as recruits, ma'am?
Correct.
In each class, or by year, or what? I'm sorry.
Currently.
There's 4 or 15% of the class.
In the current class that graduates next week, there are 4 African Americans.
And in talking to the officers about ESOP, when they, wanting to join ESOP, there appears to be some issues, and this is not something we can discuss right now because I don't have the details. I don't recall the details, but there seems to be some concerns or inconsistencies in the academy as well. So I'm hoping that we can look into that. The new Board of Commissioners can look into addressing what's going on in the academy as well, making sure that officers are treated fairly through that process as well. And I had one more thing. Okay, in that same vein, you mentioned that we should come look at your academy and training because you feel like you're on solid ground. But I just don't really see that being the case. Again, you're new, so I don't want to really push the issue, but I do want to make my concerns heard or visible to the fact that I think there's some work that needs to be done in both the academy and in the training process. I'll leave it there. I'll hold my other questions.
Councilman Harder.
Yes, thank you. In the last 6 months, an escalation in the homicide rate, both in the city of St. Louis and in certain parts of St. Louis County. Do you have any plans that you're going to implement to bring these numbers down as we move forward to complete the rest of the year and beyond? And what's your actions in that area?
I think the homicides, first and foremost, escalated during the period of COVID because of the not being able to go out, being cramped inside, being forced to stay inside, not going anywhere. That, I think, has escalated tensions for one part. Secondly, homicides tend to always increase during the summer months. So moving forward, it's really addressing those areas that we can address through police patrols. You know, you can't prevent all homicides, but a lot of our homicides are domestic violence related. And putting out more education about domestic violence and giving them alternatives to violence and getting better and more swift information to people. Those are the areas that we're going to have to move for. With your day-to-day homicides have so many factors involved in them. To say that we're going to stop all homicides, I think is probably extremely wishful thinking. But decrease the numbers, we have to look at the areas that we can address, those related to domestic violence, those related to street robberies, through increased patrols, through getting officers back out into the communities. Those are the areas where we can really hit hardest and address homicide.
I think we've seen a huge increase in the amount of aggravated assaults with a firearm, and that's usually the precursor to more violent actions either later on or leading up to. Do you see any kind of programs or efforts to reduce that precursor so that we don't, a week, a month, a year later have a spike in homicides because of that anger and that is being put towards people with the use of a gun?
Well, one of the programs that we've instituted that's been very, very effective is called ShotSpotter. It's a program that we use, we've tried it out in the North County precinct, and it identifies where shots are fired, and it narrows it down to a very small location. Officers respond. They can seize these shell casings from these, and we can narrow it down to a very, very close area. And we've had really good luck with identifying these shell casings, putting them through investigative processes, tying them to other crimes. And once we locate the people who are involved in these, we've been able to solve other crimes through that. So getting that gun off the street, identifying where these shootings are coming from, stopping the just random shootings that we're having in the air and people being irresponsible with firearms, has really addressed this future prevention aspect of it, I believe. That's been one program that's been really effective.
And finally, what is the homicide rate so far this year, and how many of those cases have been cleared?
I can tell you that the rate is up from last year. We believe it's 68, 69. And so far, we've cleared 83% of those homicides.
Okay, thank you.
Madam Chair?
Yes, Councilman Fitch.
Thank you. Chief, we saw this after the activities and events in Ferguson where many police officers left the force. I think the number that Chief Belmer used was about 10% of the officers left the force and directly attributed to the events in Ferguson about, putting their families through this and things like that. What, now that this is going on in our community again, are you hearing anything like that about officers wanting to depart? And what are you doing as far as emotional support for your officers, suicide prevention, those type of things?
Well, I think that this go around is different than Ferguson. And then when I keep saying we learn the lessons of Ferguson, we learn the lessons of Ferguson. We don't have our officers on the line 28 days with no days off. We give them time off. We didn't cancel vacations. We didn't cancel a lot of other things that we did last time. We changed the focus. We have not become near as engaged with the protesters this time, and the protests this time are far more peaceful for the most part than they were. We have also started a program within the police department due to the nationwide increase in suicide by officers. We're developed the start of a program, and we've also sought grant money to start up a suicide intervention program for our officers here. So as a result of Ferguson, we also saw officers having their identity stolen, having all sorts of issues with their families. So we developed and really increased and improved our Family Welfare Association here and committed to performing acts with them, involvement with the family, understanding of how the family feels in these events, and holding events all year long that the Family Association is involved in, and really made it a part of the police department. So no, I haven't, to ask your question, seen any officers resigning due to this. This was a very limited footprint so far, and we were only involved in maybe 8 or 10 days of this. We have gone back to our normal hours today, and hopefully the officers will have not felt the all-encompassing effects of the go-around in this time that they did in Ferguson the first time.
Thank you.
Madam Chair.
Councilman Trey, go ahead.
Thank you very much. First, Chief, welcome. Great to have you. Looking at you there, you're a great example about what dedication, commitment, hard work, and grit shows that there are no ceilings. It's really great to have you as Chief. Judge Price, great to see you again. So, Chief, I just want to commend you and your force, your men, and the way they've conducted themselves and the results that they've generated over the last 10 days. I think we're an example to the country, actually, in terms of temperance, discipline, and control. So I commend you on that. I do have a few questions I'd like to ask you regarding defunding the police and some other issues. But before I get to those, Chief, you're familiar with the concept of police nullification, are you not?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you. Police what?
Police nullification.
Nullification.
Yes, no.
Okay, well, let me give you a definition. You tell me if it makes sense or if you agree with it. Some people would call it also the Ferguson effect. And by that, I mean that once police come under intense scrutiny and accusation following a highly visible event like we're experiencing now, they have a tendency, not just your department, any department, all departments, to scale back on their level of policing and be more constrained in terms of being proactive with respect to their policing duties. The result of that is a spike in crime, particularly violent crime. Would you agree with that?
I would agree that that's probably the definition, and I would agree that some people believe that, but I would say I do not agree that all police departments engaged in that, and I would question the amount of that happened after the first round of Ferguson, and I would say that has not happened after this round at all.
Well, clearly, I agree with you with this round. I think there was some effect. Certainly, we saw it in Chicago after Laquan McDonald's killing, in Baltimore with Freddie Gray. I mean, and so where I'm going with this is police nullification can result in a exponentially large spike in crime, particularly violent crime. Would you agree with that?
I would agree that if police officers don't do their job and don't take a vested interest in the communities they serve, that it is a possibility that violent crime could increase.
And would you also agree, Chief, that spike generally is going to present itself in areas and neighborhoods that already have a challenge with respect to crime?
Yes.
And so now I'm shifting the focus a little bit with this idea that we're hearing about lately of defunding police. If that were to happen, wouldn't that necessarily result in some restriction on the most efficient policing and the ability of your department or any other department for that matter to effectively do their job?
Well, I would absolutely agree that that would happen. When you defund or you divert money to other agencies and you have to lessen the number of officers who can respond and who can respond in an effective and efficient manner, I really think that hardest hits the areas that need policing the most.
I see. I agree with that. And then, Chief, also with respect to this idea of defunding, wouldn't that also necessarily impact your ability to recruit talented candidates to become police officers?
Oh, I absolutely think it would. And times were tough before this incident with Mr. Floyd, and I think that you are going to see the effect moving forward for several months to be able to even adequately go into areas to recruit minority candidates. I think it's going to have a effect far into the near future about our ability to do that. And we saw that after Ferguson as well. So I think that not only do we have this defund, but we're sending a message to minority candidates who would have applied through everything that's going on, that maybe it's not the best job and don't bother to apply. And I think that's going to be a huge hurdle for us to overcome in the next several months into the next year.
All right. Councilman Trey, were you finished with your questions?
No, I got one more question.
Okay, go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you. Chief, I was talking about, if you're familiar with this concept or this movement called 8 Can't Wait.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Am I correct, Chief? And just so the record's clear, my understanding of 8 Can't Wait are 8 focused and featured improvements or policies that police departments should adopt in order to reduce excessive use of force. Would that be a fair definition?
Yes, sir.
Am I correct, Chief, that the St. Louis County Police Department has already adopted all 8 of those measures?
Yes, sir.
Okay, and just so the record's clear, I'm going to go through them, Chief, and you tell me again whether or not we've already adopted them. One would be exhaust all alternatives before shooting.
Yes, that would be address all reasonable alternatives prior to shooting.
Okay. Another would be require all use of force to be reported.
Yes, we already do that.
Third one is ban chokeholds and strangleholds.
Yeah, absolutely. We have never had that in our policy.
4 is establish the use of force continuum.
Yes, sir. That's written clearly in our use of force policy.
5th would be require de-escalation.
Yes, sir. That's taught to every officer every year.
Next would be a duty to intervene if you saw something wrong.
Yes, sir. That currently exists in our articles and code of conduct.
Number 7 would be a ban at shooting at.
Yes, sir. That exists in our use of force policy.
And then finally, Chief, the last one of these 8 is require a warning before shooting.
Yes, that is in our policy.
Right. And so once again, the St. Louis County Police Department has already adopted all of these 8 so-called cutting-edge measures.
Yes, sir. It's fair to say that several of these have been in our policies since the 1990s, and all of them have been there since 2010.
Thank you, Chief. And again, thank you and your whole department for the exceptional work you're doing. Appreciate it very much. That's all I have for now, Madam Chair.
Thank you. And I do believe the Chief has a hard stop at 2:30, so this might be the final question where she is here, but I have a little bit of a different question, and this might be one that Chairman Price will be responsive to as well. But I would like to hear more about the relationship between the two of you vis-a-vis each of your roles and how you all, as leaders of the police department, communicate with each other and collaborate with each other and what that looks like.
Yeah, I'll be happy to, Chief.
I would just speak to this real quick, and then I apologize. I do have to go, and I want to tell you I really appreciated this opportunity, and thank you so much for allowing me to speak before the council. But I would say this. Myself, Chairman Price, and all the members of the board have an excellent relationship. They know they can call me at any time. I see us as a group that can bounce ideas off each other, get the best idea we possibly can, and move forward. It's very interactive. I welcome their input. They listen to my ideas. And I think moving forward, we are going to have one of the most efficient and effective boards that this police department has seen in a long time, because we are committed to change, and we are committed to doing the right and ethical thing. And I think when you have those factors, There's no stopping. Thank you so much for your time, everyone. I really appreciate it. Chairman Price.
Yeah, I am not a formal person. We talk, we visit. And I'm also not the sole representative of the Board of Police Commissioners. 5-person board, every single commissioner is active and engaged and feels comfortable calling and visiting with a chief and trying to move the department in a way that's helpful. Although we have a great luxury here that the department, with exceptions, is a solid, fine police department. And so our effort can be on making it better, not throwing everything out.
One thing that I think that we might need to spend some more time on in the future is to bring you all back and to maybe dig into some specific plans and data about some of the topics that we've discussed. And it sounds like the council is probably wanting more of that. So when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and when we talk about community engagement, yes, it sounds like you're working on those things, but what are the specific plans? What pieces are in place? What resources are being put into that? And when can we see some movement on some of those things? I think is going to be really important, especially as we start to tee up over the next few months going into our budget cycle. So I think that's something that we can continue to discuss and perhaps bring you back for in due time, Chairman.
Madam Chair.
Madam Chair. Yeah, Councilwoman Days, unless you wanted to piggyback on that question, if Chairman Price has a response to that, I wanted to.
Okay, he can respond,
sure.
And then I can come afterwards. That's fine.
Okay.
Yeah, I was going to say we welcome the opportunity to visit with you. We need to work together with you as much as we need to work with the entire community. You're the community's representatives. One thing, we have been set back in a time-wise situation with the circumstances. No sooner do we have Chief Barton selected than we come full-fledged into COVID-19, and we were in COVID-19 before that. So many of the things we've been working on have been delayed. There's no excuse about that. It has been. COVID-19, and then these past 10 days have absolutely captured the entire concentration of the department. And we will try and move forward on those areas you're speaking about, because those are board concerns as well.
Councilwoman Days.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I did not realize that the chief had a 2:30 hard line that she had to stop. So Chairman Price will probably have to take the brunt of most of my comment here. And it starts with leadership. And I just want to say that as a leader, you are the leader of the commission and she is the leader of the police force. Your leadership is to set the tone for how the rank and file and everyone that is under the chief will respond to these different issues. And so the leadership is what I'm making sure that you understand where I'm coming from. That's who I'm going to look to see how we are addressing all of these issues, because the rank and file is going to follow your examples. And that's true in any organization. So you cannot address an issue if you don't accept the fact that there is one in the first place. And I'm speaking of racism. It happens here. It is happening here in St. Louis County every single day. It is happening in your department. And you cannot in any circumstances address this concern unless you recognize that there is a fact. And so I expect you and I expect Chief Barton to move forward in that. Yes, you can help this. But when you look at protesters and you talk about, the violence and this kind of thing, we wouldn't have to have protesters if we had folks doing what they are supposed to be doing in the first place. There would be no necessity for protest if Mr. Floyd wasn't murdered before everybody, and so everybody could see it. The fact that we now have video cameras everywhere, it is going to be virtually impossible to hide behind the fact of we didn't know, we didn't see. I don't think that Minneapolis had a policy said that you would put your knee on someone's neck until they were dead. So what I want to just make sure that you understand is that I'm looking for the leadership. I'm looking for you to guide this department in the way that it should go so that we do not have a Floyd or a Ahmaud or anyone else who can come to their demise at the hands of the police department. I do appreciate you coming. You know, we've had conversations before, but I think that we need to address the fact that it exists. And let's not try to sweep that under the rug as if we don't have a problem here. We do have a problem. We can address this problem, and you can address that problem if you engage all of us in the solutions that should be coming forth. So that's my comment. It was going to be my comment to the chief. So I guess Chairman Price, you'll have to take that message. Thank you.
Well, I'm happy to take that message. I wouldn't. My sense is there are racial issues in our community that need to be addressed. I agree with you about that. And to the extent that this police department is part of our community, it needs to be addressed within this police department as well. And we will do our very best to do that. And I hope I didn't misspeak earlier. The results of the past 10 days seemed to me that there were two different groups that we were dealing with. One were peaceful protesters who had every right to protest, had a message to send that everyone needed to hear. That is what our country's about. But then there was also a far smaller group of people who were violent, who shot, who intended physical injury and harm. Those people have to be controlled for the safety of everyone. And I think there were two separate groups here, one to be commended, the other not. And our duty as a police department is on both of those sides to allow and facilitate peaceful, constructive protest, demonstration, social movement, but the other to protect the people of St. Louis County.
Thank you. And I don't want to get to the point where we're pivoting on the situation. I clearly understand that. I clearly know that, but understand that, you know, we've had people to try to do this peacefully. It has really gotten us nowhere. This is 2020, and we're still dealing with the same kind of racism issues that we have dealt with over the last 200 years. So I hear you. I understand the two groups, but we don't want to pivot from what the initial reaction is. A murder took place. And so in order for there to be some kind of resolution to that, sometimes people have to go in a direction that, you know, maybe the rest of us would not do that. But we have to understand that there is a reason for that, and not the reason, not a good thing for looting and the violence. I'm not talking about that. But the fact of the matter is that sometimes you have to raise your voice in order to be heard. And I think that that's where a lot of people are. They're not being heard. Colin Kaepernick wasn't being heard. They pivoted on him talking about the flag. It never was about the flag. It was about the fact of dealing with racism in this country. And we have to call it for what it is. So thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate that.
I like to chime in.
Thank you. Oh, go ahead, Councilwoman Gray.
Yes, I spoke. I had another meeting not too long ago regarding the same issue, and we do talk about the fact that since there are cameras now, you know, we see more, we know more about it. But we've known this for years, since 60s and 70s, when they did televise the protests and they were beaten and they were water was thrown on them with hot water hoses. It was on television. We saw police brutality. So I just want to again reiterate that there needs to be some discussion and then there needs to be action. We can't keep saying we already have training. That's not working. We have to hire the right people. I don't know, and I'm sure the chief, I keep calling him Chief Justice. I'm sorry. The president of the commission, the chair of the commission, he may not be able to answer this. I don't know how many African Americans are in the academy doing the training. I don't know that. I don't think there's but one from the last conversation I've had. Change has to come from circle at this point. It is on television much more, but it has always been the case. And again, when it was mentioned earlier that they're on solid ground, that is not true. And I just want to make sure that our police commissioners, and I'm sure they're listening, realize what has happened before they got on the commission. And we need to deal with our current officers, African American and white, that interaction and relationship, and then with the community's interaction, black and white, and otherwise, of course, minority groups as well. So I'll end it there.
Madam Chair, just one follow-up.
Yes, go ahead, Councilman Fitch.
And I will call it a challenge to this council and to anyone out there watching and listening, is what are you doing to refer good applicants to the police department? How are you going to help? How are you going to get folks that look like you and me and everyone else on this council to come forward and be police officers? That is a challenge that I would like to put out to everyone, is what will you do to recruit good people to this police department? Because that's what it takes. That's what it takes to make your police department be representative of the entire community, is everybody pitching in and everybody referring people. So I'd like to see the council do that.
Any other questions or comments?
Madam Chair.
Councilman Trey.
Thank you. I just want to follow up on Councilwoman Days' remarks, and I would be remiss if I didn't. In fact, I do not believe there's ever a justifiable reason for looting.
I didn't say it was.
And so I think, please, can I finish? Please, I don't want to get conflated or confused here. I don't think anyone on this body anyway has anything but the highest regard for the legitimate exercise of First Amendment rights in the form of protest. It's when those protests cross the line at the hands of a few and conduct themselves in what is, without a doubt, criminal activity. And I will never condone that. It will never be appropriate, regardless of what the instigation or motivating factor is. So I just needed to articulate that, and I appreciate the moment, Council Chairman.
You know, before I proceed, I want to say, as a white person, this is hard stuff to talk about, because we are living in a system in which all of us with white skin benefit every day. And it's very different, obviously, than Councilwoman Gray and Councilwoman Days, and even the black law enforcement officers. And I just want to name that. And I know it's very difficult to move through that discomfort in order to explicitly name systemic racism as a problem that holds all of us back. We know it's happening in our police department. We know it's happening in every nook and cranny of St. Louis County government and in other institutions and pockets of our community. And we have to be bold and courageous and truthful about naming that before we can agree on where we're going to go from here. And I think that is also part and parcel to Councilman Fitch's point in recruitment. You know, I was a teacher for a long time. teacher recruitment was really important too, especially recruiting applicants that looked like our community. But people want to know they're entering into a system where they are going to be treated with respect and dignity as they show up to work every day. And so there's no easy answers to this. This is a really important conversation that we're having, though. And as we have this conversation, we also need to be thinking about taking some real action, because I know there are people who are tired, sick and tired of the talk.
Sick and tired.
Sick and tired of being sick and tired. And, you know, I need to step up. All of us need to step up. And I'm disappointed that I don't know everyone is quite there yet, but we will get there. I'm committed to getting us there. Councilman Harder.
Thank you. I agree with some of the things that you said there. I think we all have to take a part in this. We have to take our place and how we can see this on a daily basis. I think we have to look at it in a lot of different ways. We have to talk. I think we talk a lot past each other. I think we have to talk to each other. And that's not just the council, that is society right now. We're too tied up, unfortunately, in our electronics, and we talk past each other. And we have to start at the grassroots in our neighborhoods and in our workplaces and other places like that, of learning about each other and honest discussions. And I am challenging myself to do that as well. On a slightly different note, on the last board of police commissioners that we had, I encouraged them to come before our council at least 4 times a year. And I want to encourage Chairman Price to take those opportunities, either self-initiated or maybe we'll initiate it. But I think that would be a positive step to understand what the board is doing on a daily basis or a quarterly basis going forward, and the issues that you're dealing with, because you see a lot of these problems as a policy board. You see what's coming up, what's bubbling up from the rank and file, whether it's lawsuits or disciplinary issues or training issues. And it would be nice if we started to do that as well, so that we can address this as it's happening and not have to wait until we've got a crisis on our hands and we now have to go backwards to try to correct the problems. It'd be nice if we had a heads up on where we're headed with certain problems, so they don't become the big problems that we see today. So I would encourage the board, the police board that is, and the chairman to seek out those opportunities to meet with us on at least a quarterly basis, separate from budget discussions and all that, but just to go and understand both of our sides of this governing process of the police department. That's my challenge to the council and to the police board. Thank you.
We'll be more than happy to do that. I mean, I think that's just a fine request.
Any final comments or questions before we move into public comment? I am hearing none. We will move. Oh, go ahead, Councilwoman Gray.
Just to comment on Councilman Fitch's comments or request, it is difficult when to recruit minorities because they don't have a good connotation of what it is like to be a police officer, and recognition, I should say, of what it's like to be a police officer. So it's hard to get young people to want to go into the academy because they just don't see a lot of positive officers. For whatever reason, I'm not going to speculate on that, but so we have to work on that as well. Again, with the community-based policing and other issues surrounding what we're going through now. So we can't just assume that because people are out there that they just want to, like she said, everybody doesn't want to be a teacher. No, everybody doesn't want to be a police officer. But something I learned, like I said before, is if your interaction with the police officer is negative and you're under the age of 14 or 15, you will almost forever, think negatively of police officers if your first interaction is not a positive one. So that's something we need to think about.
Madam Chair, Madam Chair.
Go ahead, Councilwoman Dunaway.
I just want to share this anecdote. One of my friends of color, a Black man, told me a story. He was pulled over sometime in the last year for speeding, and his son was in the back seat, 10 years old, crying, screaming hysterically. The police officer felt so bad that he just let them go. But here we have this 10-year-old Black boy crying in the back seat because he's terrified that his dad is going to die. I am sorry, but that is on us to fix. That is racism. That is a perfect example of racism. This young kid is growing up believing that the police hate him, and any interaction that he or his family has with the police is going to result in someone's death. This is what our community is grappling with right now. And I think the more that we pretend that there is no such thing as racism, we continue to ignore this problem, and we're never going to be able to fix a problem that we can't even admit we have. And so I would like for all of us here to think about that, to think about this poor little kid who is deathly afraid of the police, who are here supposedly to protect and serve, and think about what all we can do, not just to recruit better police officers, but to promote better engagement between our police officers in all communities in St. Louis County.
And Councilwoman Dunaway, I would argue that we have a status quo right now that isn't working for a lot of people. I think there's a lot of officers that are unhappy right now too, and I want to recognize that. Moving on to public comments.
Yes, Madam Chair. Our first public comment is Heath Borders, 657 Atalanta Avenue, Webster Grove, 63119. Police have license to kill citizens, thus we must hold them to the highest public standard. Doctors and lawyers are held personally liable for their abuses and mistakes. Similarly, police should be held personally for theirs. The county should stop paying for police settlements and instead make police pay the settlements from their pension fund. Older officers likely hold the most power within the department and also have the most to lose from a defunded pension. Thus, we can give older, higher-ranking officers the incentive to report and fire bad police. No such incentives exist now. If federal or state income rules prevent using pensions for settlements directly, the county could halt pension payments in an amount equivalent to a bond payment amount for a settlement. If the county may not suspend pension payments, make police individually liable and force them to carry malpractice insurance. Bad police will have higher premiums and eventually won't be able to afford to continue working after enough bad actions. From Kelly Palmer, 5727 Langley Avenue, St. Louis, Missouri, 63123. Hello, social workers offer a wide range of expertise in areas such as mental illness, diversity, verbal de-escalation, addiction, trauma, PTSD, mediation, suicidal ideation, assessment, domestic violence, child welfare, knowledge, and connections to social service agencies, and much more. The police are confronted with these issues and more on a daily basis. Does the St. Louis County Police Department have any current or future plans to hire licensed clinical social workers to assist the police? And our final comment this afternoon is from Kevin Palm, 8593 Colonial Lane, St. Louis, Missouri 63124. Will the new police chief plan to support policing of communities with officers who live within or reflect the demographics of the community they will serve? That is all the public comments, Madam Chair.
Before I call for adjournment, any final thoughts, comments, questions from any of the council members?
Thank you very much, Chief
ahead.
Price, for participating and coming in and listening to our concerns today. I really appreciate that, you and the Chief. And that's it, Madam Chair. Are you looking for a motion to adjourn?
Only if there are no further comments or statements. Doesn't sound like there are. Thank you also, Chairman Price, and to the Chief for coming today. I believe this will be the first of what will end up being several conversations about this important topic as we work together to forge ahead. Yes, motion to adjourn.
That was my motion.
Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed?
Aye.
Motion carries. The meeting is adjourned. Thank you.